Hey everybody, welcome to the webinar. We're just going to wait for a couple more minutes till everybody joins, so about 4:03. Feel free to start introducing yourselves in the chat, and we'll get started in about 2 more minutes. Thank you so much for joining. For those folks just coming on, we're going to start in about 1 more minute, 2 more minutes at 4:03 to see, make sure we get as many folks as possible coming on. And feel free to say hi in the chat. If you're in the chat, make sure you choose, if you can, to chat to all panelists and attendees. That way everyone can see whom you're texting. I see some folks just chatting to all panelists, and that's wonderful, but that would just be me and a couple folks from PRA. And while we love you and want to say hello to all of you, you might want to say hello to everybody else. Ev is wondering if everyone is muted, and yes, everyone is muted while you're coming. There'll be a little tech overview, but this is actually a webinar format, not a regular Zoom call, so everyone who's coming in is currently muted. It's 4:03. I'm actually going to give it 1 more minute because I am your generous, benevolent overlord. And if you're just joining, say hi in the chat. Everyone is muted as they're coming in. And if you are saying hello from in the chat, make sure that you're replying in the little drop-down menu to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, you're just responding to me and a couple other folks from PRA, which again is wonderful, but you might want to be saying hi to everyone. And here from PRA, we have 3 other folks. Asterisk tech support is the amazing Olivia Lawrence-Weilman, who will be answering any tech support questions. So if you have any questions about what's going on your end with Zoom, you can privately message her. We have our managing director, Greeley O'Connor, and we have our communications manager, Koki, who will be helping me out with the facilitation. All right, I cannot postpone it any longer. It is 4:04. We will have a moment to introduce ourselves even further. But let's get started. I am so happy to share this space with you today and to help us all build intersectional responses to anti-transgender rhetoric based in feminism. If you're not familiar with Political Research Associates, we are a think tank who researches the American right to build capacity among our allied organizations in pursuit of a multiracial feminist democracy. My name is Heron. I'm the senior research analyst for LGBTQI justice here at PRA. I monitor anti-LGBTQI rhetoric here in the US and abroad with a focus on anti-trans rhetoric and advocacy. I also monitor the spread of religious exemptions, and I write about child welfare systems and conversion therapy. My email is right here, h.greensmith@politicalresearch.org, and then my Twitter is @Heron. I use they pronouns. And PRA's Twitter is @PRA Eyes Right. That's capital P, capital R, capital A, capital E, YES, capital R, IGHT. You have all been introducing yourselves, but if you have not yet, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Remember to select from the drop-down menu all panelists and attendees. I'd love to hear if folks want to share their name, their title, their geographic area. Optional if you'd like to share your pronouns. You can also change your name visible on the Zoom, although I don't know if that's possible with webinars, to show your pronoun. And then lastly, I would love to hear what you would like to share or learn today. And while you are writing those down, I'm going to ask Koki to pick out a few things that people would like to share to learn today to share with us all. So let's take 30 seconds to say hi to one another. And then if you have something you'd like to share or learn, drop it in the chat and Koki will start reading those. I'm seeing a lot of amazing people.
Catherine Jenkins from Vancouver is interested in learning more about dog whistles.
Yes, me too. A lot of dog whistles. All right, let's go through the agenda, and then Koki, if there's anything else that pops up where you can take a pause after the agenda and go through those as well.
Sure.
So today we're going to start by reaffirming shared values. We're going to then identify and locate the actors advocating against justice for trans and gender nonconforming folks using feminist rhetoric. And then finally, we're going to work together to build confidence in how to respond to anti-trans feminist rhetoric with intersectional feminism. So I want to pause here and before we begin to give a little bit of context. So at PRA, we monitor and expose the leaders of right-wing movements and networks and organizations, but we don't condemn people who adhere to right-wing rhetoric because we believe that everybody has the ability to redeem themselves and find the space to move left. And because, importantly, we understand that so many of us carry vestiges of racism and sexism and classism within us. So it is extremely likely that you know someone, perhaps even someone close to you, who might use feminist rhetoric to justify their anti-trans thought or their anti-trans advocacy. I do, personally. So this training is designed to help us identify two separate things, the leaders and the rhetoric, so we can combat both. So by exposing leaders and understanding rhetoric, we can stop its spread within the right, but more importantly, within our own communities. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by intersectional feminism. So intersectional feminism is feminism that is inclusive of all of the intersecting identities that people embody and that inform how society views and treats us, like ability, color, race, gender identity, national origin, citizenship, sexual orientation, economic security, educational attainment. Intersectionality was introduced by a Black woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's fundamental to Black feminist and womanist thought and practice. Look at, for example, Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives platforms. Intersectional feminism recognizes that interlocking systems of power impact those who are most marginalized in society, and that our multiple identities impact how we walk in the world. This contrasts with what has been called, and what I call here, white feminism, concretized by theorists like bell hooks. So white feminism describes, in contrast, feminist theories that look at remedying sexism alone, without addressing how authoritarianism wields the patriarchy as merely one method of oppression, and how intersecting systems of oppression impact us all, especially those of us who are living at the intersections of multiple marginalized identities. You can see historical white feminism in, for example, the women's suffrage movement that prioritized suffrage for white women over everyone who was disenfranchised, and modern white feminism in feminist arguments against the decriminalization of sex work, for example, in the popularity of girl bosses and leaning in, or in the banning of Muslim head coverings. All right, before we go
to jump in with.
Yep.
Lorraine from Transcare BC wants to know about how to approach people who are trans exclusionary or anti-trans but are open to learning versus approaches for dealing with those who are not. Lauren McGinnis from PFLAG National is really interested in any geographic or cultural differences related to ugly rhetoric.
Incredible. This is going to be so good. I'm so excited. Okay, let's do some tech and then we can get into the meat. I see also someone here saying that folks on mobile devices may need to click on the slide to make it larger. I try and have the text as large as possible for legibility, but yeah, I'm sorry about that if that happens for any folks. All right, so we said already everyone's gonna be muted throughout. Use the chat to talk to one another, ask questions, raise issues. If you have a tech problem, privately chat to the person named asterisk tech support. They should be at the top, the very top of your list when you click the drop-down menu in the chat. And then finally, if you're still having major tech issues, please email contact@politicalresearch.org and someone will be monitoring that account. All right. To make sure we're all starting from the same place, let's talk a little terminology. So as you're scanning through these definitions, which I apologize, are pretty tiny, you'll see that they're slightly different from the ones that most orgs use in their glossaries. I wanted to use these to remind us all how much emphasis we as a society, and especially anti-trans feminists in particular, place on our genitals to literally define us. If you have any questions about these definitions specifically, drop them in the chat. We have so many brilliant people on the call today to help us kind of crowdsource answers. But I wanted to remind us all that labels the LGBTQ community use, like gay and lesbian and bisexual, transgender, asexual, genderqueer, polyamorous, these are all adjectives. They describe a person, but they aren't that person. And then two final notes before we really dive into the content. First, I want to place a really strong content note on this presentation for trans and for gender nonconforming people and for their friends and loved ones. This topic is super heavy and it contains hateful and painful messages. So if you need to care for yourself and step out, please do that. Rather have you here for a long time than here right now. Second, want to address the elephant in the room. Isn't this a presentation about TERFs? And the answer is, of course it is. And at the same time, no, it's not. So TERF, or trans exclusionary radical feminists, make a lot of these same claims. For those of you wondering, TERF is not a hateful word, despite what some people who root their anti-trans rhetoric in feminism may say. White supremacists don't like to be called white supremacists, nor racists. TERF is a description, the same as white supremacist. It was put into popular use by a cisgender feminist blogger in 2008. To use for her as a shorthand to describe one cohort of feminists who self-identify as radical, but who are unwilling to recognize trans women as sisters. The real reason I don't use TERF in this presentation is that many people who disagree with TERF activism and TERF advocacy, or who don't identify as radical feminists, or who feign disgust with the term TERF, still root their own anti-trans rhetoric and advocacy in feminism. And this training is about them too. So instead, we're going to discuss the larger umbrella of anti-trans activists who ground their activism in what they call feminism. And while this group does include queer and straight people, women and men, people of all races and ethnicities, the majority are white, cisgender women. Here's what this training is not. It's not a Trans 101. It's not a guide to combating all transphobia. It's not a replacement for working in true solidarity with trans-led organizations, trans-led movements, and trans people. It is a tool to help individuals and organizations like y'all understand who is behind anti-trans rhetoric rooted in feminism and how to build confidence in responding to anti-trans feminist rhetoric with intersectional feminism. All right, let's start. I'm gonna start by establishing some shared truths I would like us all to hold. And while you're reading these, please drop your own in the chat. And at the end, Koki will raise up 2 or 3 shared truths to make our discussion even richer. First, trans and gender nonconforming people have been important parts of every single society since the beginning of human history. Second, in most modern societies, trans people face harassment, discrimination, and violence. And lastly, trans and gender nonconforming people are resilient and powerful, and they formed the foundation of modern US LGBTQ advocacy. Koki, are folks adding some more truths, or are people still excited about talking about TERFs, it looks like?
It's a little quiet still, so we do encourage people to add their own truths. Now is a great time.
I'm just warming everybody up for the real hard stuff. So if folks are still getting warmed up, I'm okay with that. I'll keep talking and they can share their truths.
Missy said people are the experts on their own gender identity.
Yes. and sometimes not even the expert there. It took me 36 years to come out as agender. Patriarchy is a hell of a cloaking device.
Catherine Jenkins says there is incredible diversity within the trans community that sometimes isn't represented well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. All right, moving from truths into values, safety and health and living free from violence. These are values that most people share. I'm gonna talk a little bit more, but I want everyone, if they can, to share a little bit about how they see safety and health and a life free from violence as values that show up in their own lives or in their own organizations. So some research finds that people who are more likely to identify as conservative are also more likely to strongly respond to apparent threats to the safety, to the health, or to the ability to live free from violence of their identified in-group. This can also be called the circle of empathy or the circle of moral concern. So there was a 2nd century Greek philosopher named Hierocles, and he described individuals as consisting of a series of of circles. The first circle is the human mind, and then the immediate family, followed by the extended family, the local community, the neighboring towns, the country, and the entire human race. And our task, according to Hierocles, was to draw all of those circles in toward the center, transferring everyone to the circle of greatest moral concern, that inner circle, where we understand that safety and health and a life free from violence are important for all of us. So here is Hierocles' circles of empathy. Apologies for the gender essentialism in literally the worst possible presentation. So as I said, Hierocles said it was our duty to draw all the circles into the center, making every human part of our circle of moral concern. But as I said, there's some evidence that conservative people are more activated by fear and disgust than people who are more likely to identify as progressive. And so conservative people may draw thicker lines between these groups and look for ways to distinguish between people whom they include in their circles and people whom they exclude. And this is related directly to the conserve and conservative, right? The belief that governments and communities must preserve and conserve resources that create safety and create health and create a freedom from violence. This is called the scarcity mindset. It's shared by many conservative people who believe that conservation means drawing a line between those who deserve access to certain resources and those who do not. And one of the largest ways to make that distinction is through gender essentialism. Koki, I see some more truths coming in. Do we want to raise up a few more? They seem amazing.
Yes, we had one from Zoe that sex is socially constructed. And from Helen that society is transphobic by default, so we're born into it and the playing field is unequal.
Yes. So let's dive a little bit more into how feminism is used as justification to exclude and harm trans people. So when anti-trans feminists talk about safety and health and lives free from violence, they're talking about about the importance of those values for cisgender women and girls, and sometimes only for white cisgender women and girls. Anti-trans feminists fundamentally believe that safety is finite, and that if not everyone can be safe, we have to create some criteria to determine who deserves safety the most. And for them, gender essentialism provides that criteria. So in contrast, those of us with an abundance mindset, we believe that we all deserve safety, we all deserve health, we all deserve a life free from violence. We believe that there are enough resources to create those conditions, not only in some far-flung future, but here on Earth today. And in fact, we know that protecting those most vulnerable among us always increases protections for all of us. Safety and health and freedom from violence are not zero-sum games. So another point of interaction, I would love to hear from folks how they see abundance showing up in their own lives and their own organizations, how they work from an abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset. Or maybe you have an opportunity to share how you felt yourself working in a scarcity mindset and instead changed to an abundance mindset and saw how it changed your work. I'd love to hear a couple of those, and I'll give folks 30 seconds of not listening to me while we write those down. And I'd love to hear, Koki, if you could pick 2 of those up, that'd be great. Thank you.
Mallory says, I think scarcity in the competition it produces sidelines energy into competition instead of meeting needs. Helen draws the connection between the scarcity mindset and underfunding or austerity politics. Naomi says an abundance mindset is helped by thinking about interconnectedness, how our fates are bound up with each other's.
And Koki, do you want to read Sam's and then we can move on? I like
Sam. Sam says, as a student at a historically women's college, there are beautiful abundance of genders. When we're free from the assumption that cis men rule, we get to make our own paths.
Thank you so much, everyone. I love the participation. This is amazing. All right, so scarcity and the resulting prioritization of who gets what scarce resources plays directly into the rights handbook, right? It allows the right to capitalize on a seeming divide in a community fighting over scraps in order to give their own advocacy the veneer of bipartisanship. The right uses this tactic over and over again. I change this example every single time I give this presentation, and right now this is a hyper current example, so you might not know what I'm talking about, but look at how the right is framing Barry Weiss's departure from the New York Times as an example of left-wing anti-Semitism, left-wing scarcity mindset, not an example of someone who is facing the negative consequences of their own bad actions, for example. All right. All right, so when I say that the right capitalizes on anti-trans rhetoric rooted in feminism, I am not kidding. You don't need to lean in and read. This is just a chart to make you think that I'm really smart and I do my work and I'm a hard worker. So this is a map I've made connecting the major advocates of anti-trans feminism to the organizations, media outlets, and public figures on the right whom they partner with. So we're going to go through the middle layer in a moment in much more depth, but I wanted to point out a few big players on the top layer here. That would be the right-wing spokespeople organizations and media who partner with anti-trans feminists. So let's see. Oh my goodness gracious. I need to skip out for a second because there we go. And I'm going to share again. Everyone's being very patient. I'm so proud of you. Yay. All right, here we go. Much better. This is the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank who influences policy throughout the right, including LGBT policy. And they consistently hold panels of anti-trans feminist activists. This, for example, is a panel in early 2019 on how terrible the Equality Act is going to be. This is Alliance Defending Freedom. They are a deeply conservative legal group who in 2016 donated $15,000 to the Women's Liberation Front to challenge Obama's Title IX guidance for transgender people. If you'd like to learn more specifically about ADF and WOLF's participation together, you can read the article that just came out yesterday on politicalresearch.org, right? Politicalresearch.org? I think so. I wonder if Koki can drop a link to that in the chat. This is the Family Policy Alliance. They are an anti-abortion, anti-LGBT litigation shop who filed a brief with the Women's Liberation Front against that same Title IX guidance and have been partnering with them ever since. This is Breitbart News. They are a hyper-conservative news organization once chaired by Steve Bannon. They regularly publish anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, pardon my French, bullshit, and then some actual neo-Nazis. and now many articles sympathetic to anti-trans feminists, including this one. WAPO reveals natural alliance of conservatives and feminist efforts to protect children from transgender treatment. They have tens of millions of visitors every month. This is the National Review. They are a foundational conservative news outlet founded by William F. Buckley. They have a host of podcasts, including one that regularly invites anti-trans feminists to join. And then this is Madeline Kearns's review of the rally in front of the Supreme Court for the Harris Funeral Home's Bostock Zarda cases. This is the Christian Post. Christian Post is a conservative evangelical newspaper with about 10 million visitors a month. And they regularly write about anti-trans feminists with their consent and with their participation. This is Michelle Cretella. She is the current chair of the American College of Pediatricians, not to be confused with the American Academy of Pediatrics. American College of Pediatricians is a small fringe group, designated a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center for their incredible anti-abortion, anti-LGBT advocacy. And in their talking points advocating against trans-affirming care, they cite heavily to anti-trans feminist researcher Sheila Jeffries. And then finally, your favorite and mine, Tucker Carlson. He needs no introduction, but he is an ultra-conservative founder of the Daily Caller, who is now with Fox News, who continues to give sympathetic interviews to anti-trans feminists. Here he is giggling with Megan Murphy from Canada, whom I'll be talking about in a moment, giggling about how trans people are a plot of the wealthy elite in the United States. To do what? I'm unsure. All right, let's look a little bit closer at 4 specific people whom I'd like to lift up for us today. Koki, any questions I should address in the chat?
No questions jumping out at me.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So this is Kelly J. Keane-Munchel. She's also known as Posy Parker in the UK, where she leads an organization called Standing for Women. If you recognize either name, it's because you were either up on anti-trans feminist news or because you read them last year when she made the news for ambushing HRC's Sarah McBride in the House of Representatives after Sarah finished up a powerful briefing with trans youth and their families. So Kelly J. Keane-Munchel has spoken to a number of right-wing publications here in the US. She was on the National Review's podcast. She regularly speaks to centrist and right-wing publications in the UK. She's attended events at Heritage Foundation. Importantly, late last year, Keane-Munchel joined Jean-François Garrapé for a 90-minute conversation on his YouTube channel to talk about anti-trans activism. And this is important. I'm sure you don't know Garrapé's name. He's a white nationalist. He's an actual Nazi YouTuber who has called for a white ethno-state. So in the UK, Keane-Munchel is the originator of a particularly insidious bit of anti-trans feminist messaging, billboards and t-shirts and newspaper ads and other print media bearing the following phrase: women, noun, adult, human, female. So when I say insidious, I mean that this is such an innocuous phrase that it just slips by those who are not monitoring the movements and messages of anti-trans feminists. And it's therefore the perfect rallying cry around which feminists and right-wing publications platforming them can manufacture outrage when asked to take these messages down. So this particular sign was projected on the National Gallery in Leeds, England. Standing for Women projected it all over Leeds and has also projected it in, for example, I think it was at the Labour Party convention, which is like the UK equivalent of the DNC. I think that was in Yorkshire, maybe. I'm sure we have some UK folks on the call who will correct me. In Liverpool. And she obviously protested when the company removed the sign after complaints. And then to coincide with this week of action where she projected it everywhere, she came to the US, she harassed Sarah McBride. Volunteers from Standing for Women and from partner organization Sisters, with an ask at it, United, put t-shirts with this message on it on statues across 50 towns in England and Wales. Next up is Megan Murphy, whom you saw talking to Tucker Carlson earlier. She's the founder and editor at Feminist Current, who, quote, provide a unique perspective on male violence against women. And those of you looking for dog whistles, there's a dog whistle for you right there. She does not mean male violence against women. She's referring to trans people. When Megan was permanently banned from Twitter for hate speech against trans folks, she gave interviews and solicited coverage from outlets like the Daily Wire, National Review, The Federalist, Christian Post, and Quillette. Megan came to DC last January as well and spoke at the DC Library about how ludicrous her Twitter ban was, quote, for just telling the truth. Her tagline is, biology isn't bigotry. The image I'm about to show you has some pretty severe anti-trans rhetoric on it, so take care of yourself. This is what got Megan banned from Twitter. All right, moving on. Let's round the corner, two more, to look at Julia Beck, who you will recognize maybe as the witness for the Republicans at the VAWA reauthorization subcommittee hearing and the Equality Act hearing in the House Judiciary Committee last year. I'm about to show you some very disturbing anti-trans rhetoric. I will not show it for very long, and I will also talk at the same time, so you can listen to me and literally close your eyes or turn your phone away or your computer. But here is what she said. And I'm going to speak and I'm not going to read the words. So what Beck and the witnesses, the Republicans who called her as a witness, are using here is a rhetorical technique called a Gish Gallop, named after this creationist, Duane Gish, in the early part of the 20th century, who would argue for creationism with like this barrage of arguments, right, regardless of their veracity or provability, with the express intention of forcing his opponents to take time to address each absurd claim and divert focus from the real conversation. So at the Equality Act hearing, this had the exact impact that the Republicans and Beck wanted. They wanted the other witnesses to have to refute her absolutely absurd claims instead of actually talking about the importance of the Equality Act. All right, last person, this is Kara Dansky. She is a member of the Women's Liberation Front, who are the most active anti-trans feminist organization here in the United States. She has written many amicus briefs to state and federal courts, urging those courts to roll back civil and human rights for trans people. In 2017, 2016, she was also the person who facilitated the donation to the Women's Liberation Front to the tune of $15,000 from the Alliance Defending Freedom, in order to join ADF in its opposition to Gavin Grimm's suit to enforce Title IX and protection of trans students. And more recently, Wolf authored a brief in support of Harris Funeral Homes, who argued in front of the Supreme Court for their right to discriminate against Amy Stevens. Wolf argued that affirming the federal definition of sex to include gender identity would, quote, erase women and girls. And in doing so, Wolf joined the Concerned Women for America Legislative Action Committee outside the Supreme Court to organize the anti-trans rally that day of the arguments. Here is what Kara wrote in Wolf's brief to the court in the Amy Stevens case. And these are headlines in the past 2 years from conservative American media outlets and organizations peddling feminism to further their anti-trans advocacy. You can have transgenderism or feminism, but you can't have both. All right, we're almost to the point where we can take a breath, but I want to emphasize that this is not a rhetorical danger. Bathroom scares are effective. Erasing women and girls scares are effective. We're seeing them work in Idaho, where a bill was just passed that would prohibit trans people from participating in their sports, their scholastic sports. Luckily, that bill is being challenged by the ACLU. The right has a history of leveraging scarcity-minded activists to tank progressive civil rights legislation. The Equality Act passed the House this year because we have a majority, a progressive majority in the House, but it did not even get a vote in the Senate. You know, it worked in the 70s when the right used Phyllis Schlafly, well, she used herself, to tank the Equal Rights Amendment, and the same tactics are being used right now to stop the Equality Act, to stop the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, and to pass these awful anti-trans athletes bills in the States. And then check the byline here. You can see it. Those of you on the phone, this is very, very tiny. But yeah, that's the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., citing to Meghan Murphy's Twitter ban. to bolster the right-wing conspiracy theory of the liberal left-leaning social media giants forwarding a leftist orthodoxy. And then that linked article there in the last line, that's Breitbart's coverage of the Twitter ban, quoting Murphy's own article in the conservative paper Quillette, where she claims that banal statements have become heresy akin to terrorist speech. So if you think that Donald Trump doesn't know about anti-trans feminists, you are wrong about that. All right. We are done with that section. We can take a break. Remove your shoulders from your ears. Sit up straight. Look away from your screen for a second. Take a breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. Hope everyone's doing okay. All right. Let's look at some disruptions. I'm going to introduce 4 disruptions that we're then going to practice in the section after this. But let's walk through these 4 disruptions first. So biology isn't bigotry. When anti-trans feminists like Megan Murphy say biology isn't bigotry, they are actually parroting about 400 years of biology-based bigotry, whose legacy includes, colonialism, slavery, genocide, disenfranchisement, and more. Biology-based bigotry literally underpins white nationalism. So when we disrupt this talking point, we remind those around us, and ourselves too, we sometimes need reminding, that biology has been used as bigotry as long as biology has been a thing. And in fact, human gender and sexual orientation are intensely complex, which is why we, those with an abundance mindset, do not discriminate on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Everyone deserves a life free from violence and a safe and a healthy life. What organizations like Women's Liberation Front, Hands Across the Aisle, and other anti-trans feminist organizations have in common with each other, and with some of the other organizations filing briefs in federal courts, asking courts to not define sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity, is this ostensible desire to preserve the safety of children, particularly girls, especially in the schools cases. But a closer look at these arguments and the lived experiences of cisgender and transgender kids reveals that these organizations are actually asking the Supreme Court to preserve the comfort of cisgender children and students, not their actual safety. And that the comfort of cis students actually comes at the cost of trans students' safety and health, particularly when these cisgender students' discomfort is at its heart simply anti-trans rhetoric and stereotypes. So during the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization hearing last year, Debbie Lesko from Arizona brought up a case of 8 or 9 cisgender women who sued their homeless shelter because the homeless shelter allowed a trans woman to come in who made them uncomfortable. So hold that in your mind for a second while we look at the disruption. So when we disrupt this safety versus comfort dichotomy, we remind ourselves and those around us that women's spaces were never actually safe for many women, including women of color, low-income women, bisexual women, women with disabilities. Safety and comfort are not the same thing. Sometimes our idea of comfort must be expanded in order to ensure safety, especially for those most vulnerable among us. And then additionally, safety and comfort can be increased through structural changes that help everyone. For example, in that homeless shelter that Debbie Lesko was talking about, where the cisgender women sued because they were in the presence of a trans person, they were forced, everyone in the shelter was forced to shower in a single big room with no stalls and no curtains. That could not have been great for anyone's safety or anyone's comfort. A structural change, like having single-stalled restrooms and shower curtains on every stall, would have vastly increased everyone's safety and comfort. So, underlying the rhetoric that trans people are, quote, taking our women and girls, is the implication, of course, that trans people are recruiting children, right? That somehow trans people are ironically reinforcing the gender binary by somehow telling children that if they are gender nonconforming, if they are tomboys, if they are femme girls, femme boys, that they must be trans. This conspiracy theory has been reinforced by recent studies by Dr. Lisa Littman out of Brown University that purported to show that there were these clusters of children who were being infected by transness, something that she called rapid onset gender dysphoria. I have a line here in my presentation that says, I wish you could see how hard my eyes are rolling, but in fact you can, and here they go. Here you go. Rapid onset gender dysphoria isn't a thing. It's a term coined by the anti-transparent boards that Lisa Littman surveyed for her research. What she calls rapid onset gender dysphoria, I call kids who didn't feel comfortable talking about their gender identity with their parents until they found a group of supportive peers whom they came out with the safety of numbers. So when you talk about disrupting the recruitment narrative, the myth of recruitment, we remind ourselves that it's actually the patriarchy that forces us to conform to strict gender roles, including LGBT people. Yes, trans people, including trans kids, feel more safer to be more visible than they have in the past. That's a good thing. Last disruption, and then we can practice ourselves. Innocuous slogans. They're another page directly out of the rights playbook. They gaslight, they spread fear. Here's what one trans woman said about the t-shirts hung on statues in her town of Newport, Wales during Keen Mitchell's Week of Action last year. She said, I walk past this monument near enough every day, and even though I know I'm hardly the only trans person in Newport, it's still very hard to not feel personally slighted by this outrageous and completely unprovoked transphobic attack. Here are some other innocuous slogans you may be familiar with. It's okay to be white. Blue lives matter. America first. Make America great again. When we disrupt these innocuous slogans, or these dog whistles, as some have said, we remind ourselves that it is in fact violent to make people afraid to walk in the street. It is violent to make people be afraid to be themselves on the internet. And it is violent to deny that your words have power, when in fact that was your very intent. All right, let's practice. Everybody get your chatting fingers ready because we're gonna do some really intense chatting now. When you practice disrupting anti-trans feminist rhetoric, you have to kind of figure out your strategy. Are you gonna respond with empathy? Is the statement or the question made in good spirit? Is the person ignorant of the impact that they may have? Maybe you want to respond with empathy. Maybe you want to redirect with humor. Maybe you want to answer with logic if the person would really respond to logic or data, for example. There's lots of other ways to respond, and I encourage people to say that in the chat. I keep gesturing over there because that's where it is for me, but obviously that doesn't make any sense for y'all. And then finally, there's always the option to ignore someone. And I want to say that we are not going to practice responding to truly hateful anti-trans messages that not just anti-trans feminists say, but that are common across all anti-trans advocates. And the reason we're not responding to those is because we don't need to respond to dehumanizing content. That is a block and a report and a walk away, and to find safety and to help others find safety. All right, so I'm gonna model the first disruption, and then we're gonna have a couple more and we can all join in. All right, here's the first anti-trans feminist dog whistle, rhetoric, whatever you wanna call it, calling card. We need to prioritize real women. I'm gonna give people about 30 seconds to think about how they would respond, either how they've responded in the past or how they would respond given what we've been talking about for the past, hour or so. And then I'm gonna go through what I say, and then we can see what's next. All right, folks, start practicing. All right. So here, I like to use logic. Real is actually a harmful construct. Some people, I can't see the chat right now, but some people I have trained with this, they resort to the knee-jerk trans women are real women, but in fact, there are no real women. Real is a construct. It's a harmful construct. It leaves out intersex people. It leaves out non-binary people like myself. It leaves out gender non-conforming people of every gender and sex. And it leaves out cisgender people who don't meet ideal definitions of real. For example, a lot of women don't menstruate and don't have the ability to have children. What is real? Where are the lines? Do real women have breasts of a certain size? Do real women's genitals look a certain way? That seems really invasive to determine what a real woman looks like. Do real women have 2 ovaries? Do real women have uteruses of a certain size? At a certain point, it becomes absolutely impossible to distinguish what is real. So let's just toss the whole thing in the garbage. And in fact, we know that there's actually an infinite variety of sex characteristics and genders. And when we prioritize the most marginalized among us, we all benefit. Koki, are there any amazing responses in the chat?
Sam says, I don't respond at all. I reach out to cis people, especially cis queers, and ask them to defend trans people on my behalf. Helen says, hey, I'm a cis woman and I recognize that I'm prioritized by default. I'm happy to support trans women in attaining equality, and if that means we prioritize them sometimes, that's okay with me. Gil often uses questions like, why?
I love that.
Those are the main ones jumping out at me right now.
That's amazing. All right. I'm going to give folks about a minute to respond and chat among each other in response to this statement. Women deserve their own spaces. Now, this chat is amazing. I am so proud of us. We're very smart and great. Koki, if I may, I'm seeing a lot of the same iteration here, which is kind of like, you know, what does safe mean? Like, what does space mean? You know, who is going to define it, right? Do you see anything else that jumps out to you?
I saw one, let's see. Annie Wilkinson says, I often try to expose the illogic or flip the logic, like exactly all of them. And I think that's another strategy in addition to asking questions and interrogating the statement. That Ben the Ark's advocacy team had a great response. I think I'd lead with questions here. What kind of spaces? What are you looking for women to have in these spaces? And then depending on the person's answer, explain the ways that these spaces are already not inclusive and who gets left out and why and what could be done to be more inclusive.
Yes. Yes. When the person is truly asking or stating something well-meaning and has a clear good motivation, having a discussion with that person can sometimes have such an impact and ripple way, way beyond them, as they have, like in this conversation together, have built confidence to be able to explain why something they've thought in the past is now different or more complexified. So here personally, I have used empathy and recentering. It's really scary to feel vulnerable and that you need your own space away from people who would harm you. It's not trans people who make spaces scary. It's the patriarchy. Most women's spaces, as people have said in the chat, have never been safe for all women, especially trans women. And in fact, subpoint, trans women face violence at shocking rates. We need to make our spaces as safe as possible for all who need it. And that gets exactly to what Ben the Arc was saying, is interrogating who the space is for, what is intended to create, and how we can make it safer for the folks it's intended for. And reminding people that safety and comfort aren't the same thing. Some people might be uncomfortable when a space is made safer for those who need it. Anything else in the chat, Koki, that we should lift up?
A lot of people had a similar point that you just made about these spaces have always been exclusionary for women, people who identify as women, are considered women, and other criteria. And so the statement itself is exclusionary.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, here's the next one. This is a big one today, and we can spend as much time on this as we need to. I'm sure a lot of folks will have either experience disrupting this talking point or hearing it from their friends or their loved ones or their board members or their donors or their constituents. You know, it's the source of legislation and litigation across the country. We have now a state, like I said, Idaho, that on the books bans trans athletes from competing at the scholastic level. Again, it's being challenged by the American Civil Liberties Union, and an absolutely incredible trans athlete herself who is bold enough to stand up to these bigots. And then the case in Connecticut, the Selena Soul case that the Alliance Defending Freedom is raising, that just prompted the Department of Education and Justice to issue a statement that they, unlike the Obama administration, interpret Title IX to exclude trans athletes from participating in sports with a team that affirms their gender identity. So I would love to hear anything people have to say about how they respond when folks say that trans people shouldn't be able to compete with, quote, real women in sports. There's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of scarcity versus abundance mindset, and I would love to hear how people have balanced those two things. Koki, whenever you want to start raising folks, I'd be happy to hear.
Sure. Helen points out that all sports are different. All sports require different skills and different bodies. Nicole says, what is the specific purpose of dividing sports by gender? What is the actual risk of allowing trans athletes to compete with cis athletes? Are those issues and concerns actually linked to gender, or are they better addressed in a different way? Ray says, if you really wanted to level the playing field and not let anyone have an unfair advantage, you would also have a problem with student athletes from wealthy families being able to afford private trainers.
Yes. This is not something I recommend using with people whom you actually want to have a conversation with, but when I'm just on Twitter being sassy, I like to point out that, you know, cis women think they deserve medals, and that there is a scarcity of medals. Again, I don't say that to people who I actually want to help bring into my multifaceted fold of understanding gender.
Lada points out that sports are for the purpose of inclusion, not exclusion. All
Yes.
cisgender women's bodies are different. There's no such thing as a level playing field even among cisgendered people.
Yes. All right, so I'll show you here what I say, but then I'd love to hear more, because this is, again, this is a really fraught topic right now. So I tend to go with data here. I had a conversation at the American Atheists Conference with this older gay man who really liked, I gave this speech and he was really excited about it. But he said, what about the women athletes? And I was like, well, did you know, you might not have, that Olympics have permitted trans athletes to compete since 2004 and the NCAA since 2011 without trans women dominating. And I know that on the call actually is Bryn Tannehill, who's written extensively about, how trans athletes have actually been in sports for as long as sports have been around. And actually their participation is incredibly heavily regulated, to the obvious detriment of trans athletes. I mean, as someone in the chat pointed out, where are the #1 trans athletes? I don't see them dominating in every single sport. And then I usually say, also in the US, 14 states prohibit discrimination in schools on the basis of gender identity. Girls still exist in those spaces and trans athletes have not dominated, and girls aren't being erased. And then going back to bringing in, and from an abundance mindset, sports is about teamwork. It's about being a good sport. And then finally, again, I would not say this to your people who you want to call in gently, but frankly, even if trans women were to dominate in every single sport tomorrow because we solved discrimination and all the medals and all the trophies went to trans women, that would be worth it. That would actually be worth it. Trans women not getting killed anymore. Cis people are saying that medals are worth more than trans lives. That's pretty fucked up, in my opinion. Koki, anything else cool?
To your last point, I've seen people pointing to the importance of trans mental health and how that is an argument against this kind of rhetoric. Jess Braverman says there are many real threats to women's sports. Equality and inclusion are not among them. These bills are being transferred with other bills promoting transphobia, not things like increasing funding for women's sports.
Yes.
Harming trans youth, not helping women's sports.
Absolutely.
Bryn Tannehill points out that when asked about trans athletes dominating, people point to one, a cyclist, and that's sort of the case in point.
Yeah. I asked this older gay gentleman at the American Atheists Conference because he brought up tennis. And I know that he was thinking of Renee Richards, but he couldn't remember her name. So I said, oh, tennis. Okay, name me one amazing top-seeded female trans tennis player. And he couldn't. And I said, okay, name me one trans tennis player, female tennis player of any rank. And he couldn't. I said, okay, name me any trans tennis player of any rank, of any gender, of any level of sport. And he couldn't. I said, okay, cool. Name me one trans athlete, a single trans athlete. And he couldn't. And I said, I think maybe what you're hearing from people isn't true. All right. Anything else around athletes we should?
Gil, connecting the issue of sports with the issue of bathrooms, looking at
Yes.
the communal changing rooms.
Yes. I want to make sure we spend as much time on this as possible for people to really practice. Yeah, Bryn says the WNBA has reiterated the trans women are welcome. There just haven't been any so far. And that could be for many, many reasons, racism and transphobia and the ability for trans girls to play basketball at an elite level throughout their schools, especially at the collegiate level.
In reference to notable trans athletes, Bryn Tannehill points out that one person isn't a trend. Statistically, trans people are underrepresented in sports.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to, I believe this is our last one. So this is around the recruitment narrative. I'll give folks about a minute again to respond to this in the chat. The dog whistle or the rhetoric. Why aren't we allowed to be butches anymore? Trans people are recruiting. And while folks are writing, I'll share another anecdote where I've been able to practice my disruption. I was at a party and there was a older white woman there. I think she would identify as a butch person who was very excited to hear about my work. And then reached a certain point and felt uncomfortable going further, talking about inclusion and justice for trans people, and described a situation where she goes to a LGBT health center here in Boston, Fenway Public Health, and she said that every time she goes in for her annual checkup, her doctor, who is male and who is cis, asks her if/when she would like to start testosterone, implying that he inferred she was a trans man. And I was told this story essentially to give the impression that trans people are constantly pressuring gender nonconforming women, especially, and gender nonconforming girls to transition. That being butch or being a tomboy is no longer allowed. And of course, the implication there is recruitment narrative, which I should add, since I have colleagues on the call, is a right-wing talking point that's used, also a very heavily anti-Semitic talking point. And the recruitment, narrative allows the right to create the specter, the boogeyman of a kind of force out there that is bigger than that is kind of amorphous and that is sucking people into its ambit, and you better watch out or you might get sucked into, or your kids might get sucked in. Koki, do we have any folks saying some good stuff around here?
Sam says, you're allowed to be butch, you're just not allowed to tell me I have to be butch, not non-binary. Recruitment goes both ways, darling. Regarding sports, again, S. Rifkin at prochoiceamerica.org says, this would be a good opportunity to press people on what kind of gatekeeping they'd actually like to see, checking people's hormones and genitals before they get to join the team. Taking this argument to its logical conclusion shows how obscene it is.
Yes, absolutely.
Zoe points to turf rhetoric along the lines of, if I'd gone to a gender clinic as a child, I could have taken hormones and transitioned, with their response being, and it's like, but you didn't, did you?
Yeah, J.K. Rowling literally said that in her recent extremely long open letter to the trans community, about her anti-trans advocacy, not to be confused with the shorter open letter that she signed on to from Harper's. But she literally said, I was a gender nonconforming child, and if I had been taken somewhere and told that I could take hormones and transition, I probably would have. Which, I'm not saying that J.K. Rowling is trans, but instead of that, and instead of me hearing that and thinking, oh, wow, trans people are really recruiting, I think, oh my God, like J.K. Rowling clearly needed to be affirmed in her own queer gender presentation and identity somehow. And she clearly feels a lack there. She is literally saying, if I had been affirmed, if I had had access to care, I could have manifested this part of me. And again, I'm not saying she's trans. I'm not saying she's a trans man. I'm saying that there is a huge spectrum between cis male and cis female and, binary sex and gender in general, that J.K. Rowling herself she cannot stop herself from affirming the multitude of genders out there by just opening that door and saying, if I had been affirmed, that's literally what she said. If I had been affirmed, things would be different. That blew my mind that she said that. Helen? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Koki.
Said that the binary between butch and trans can be totally oppressive, but it was not a trans invention.
Yes.
Amanda Goad says, for the record, some of us ideas, butch women and don't have these insecurities.
Yes, absolutely. All right, I'm gonna show folks what I say here, which I again go to affirmation and empathy. That sounds really terrible. And again, to J.K. Rowling, it sounds really terrible that you didn't feel like your upbringing was affirming and that you needed maybe to have gone to someone who could talk to you more about gender. It's not trans people who are telling you you can't be butch. That's the patriarchy. Again, the patriarchy that says that women have to be a certain way, men have to be a certain way. And I saw someone in the chat saying that doctor needs to get trained. I think it was Larry. Yeah, that doctor needs to get retrained because that doctor is operating at maybe, a step along the trans affirming spectrum. But here he is along the trans affirming spectrum, reifying the gender and sex binary. And who is that helping? He should see the person in front of him and affirm that person's sex and gender identity in the way that is healthiest for them, not impose upon them a decision. Cookie, any further thoughts before we go to the wrap up and Q&A?
Zoe shares that I'm a butch trans woman, which probably blows their minds.
Yes.
There's a good one. Ezra Nippon is agreeing with Lori. It's upsetting to have one's gender misunderstood or feel pressured about it, which is also what trans people are dealing with all the time. So that's a place to connect with solidarity.
Yes, absolutely. A common enemy, the patriarchy, right? Trans people are not taking gender away from cis people. There's not a scarcity of gender. What if there was a scarcity of gender? All right. So standing with power, now that we've built our confidence, taking this into the future, we can ask ourselves and our friends and our families and our colleagues these questions. What is true disruption of the power of anti-trans feminists? And several folks have said this in the chat. It's standing in true solidarity with trans-led, trans-serving organizations. So how is your org, or how are you working in solidarity with trans-led organizations today? How is your organization supporting trans-led advocacy and activism? And how can your organization step up to combat anti-trans activism rooted in feminism? Now, these answers are going to look really different whether you are a trans person or a gender nonconforming person, or you're here today as an individual or an individual activist, or because you're my mother. Hi, Mom. Or if you are at a women's or feminist organization, or you're at a queer-led organization, or you're at, a multitude of organizations. So I'd love to hear from people how they see their organizations within the spectrum and universe of lifting up trans-led movements, especially today, especially when we're looking to lift Black trans women into leadership, but not as tokens, as lifting up the work that they are doing because it is important to them. And how we again, there may be Black trans women on the call, how I, as a non-Black trans woman, can stand in solidarity with, and how I can best support Black trans women doing the work that they do so that they can lead to our mutual liberation. So I'd love to hear from some folks who are answering that question right now. Cookie.
Maureen O'Leary says, I'd just like to nudge that as someone who's part of the LGBTQIA community, members of the LGBTQ plus community need to be vigilant in calling out transphobia within our community. I'm always shocked by the scarcity mindset that some queer people have when talking to about trans folks. Missy says that she's having a difficult time where she is finding trans-led organizations, and is asking questions as to why those organizations aren't existing. And your mom says hi. your question about what if gender is scarce, Mel says we just invent 10 more. Helen says where TERFs have made inroads is by using official avenues to make complaints, i.e. the law, complaints, procedures, emails. We need to move away from arguing on social media and into influential spaces. Allies with access to those spaces need to open the door and give a platform to trans women of color, etc.
Yes. All right, this is off the cuff, Cookie, so I appreciate your flexibility, but I would love folks on the call to raise any organizations whom they think people should be following, either giving money to or on social media, led by Black trans folks who are doing work for their own liberation. And then we will move into Q&A. So I'm gonna queue up the Q&A slide, and if folks wanna drop in names of organizations whom we should all be following, that would be really great.
Tennessee points to the Transgender Emergency Fund in Massachusetts. Catherine Jenkins, and I second the TGI Justice Project based in San Francisco. Amanda Goad points to the Unique Women's Coalition in SoCal. Bryn Tannehill identifies the Trans Latinx Coalition, the NCAA VP. Heron points to the Okra Project. Amanda to the Transgender Cultural District in SF. Heron for the World.
I was hoping you'd say that out loud. I've never pronounced it out loud.
It can only be Gwirls.
It has to be Gwirls, right? I love it. All right, we have about 15 minutes left. I would love to both make sure we answer, as many questions as people are comfortable asking, and / use this time in a productive way. And then also, if we want to go a little bit early, that has never been a terrible thing. So why don't we say, do questions or keep on raising up Black trans-led orgs for another 7 minutes and then see where people are. Does that sound good, Koki?
That sounds great.
Awesome.
Felicity Figuera points to Orange County Trans Latinas. Sam to Angelica Ross from Trans Tech. Helen at Gendered Intel in the UK, and at Trans Kids Speak, which is the Lifting Trans Kids Voices. Ezra Nippon is pointing to Trans Justice Funding Project. Lots of California-based trans orgs. Helen at mermaids_gender, another UK-based. Heather Trans Baltimore, Lada Gender Justice League Seattle.
I'm reading along with you, Cookie.
So he says, mermaids is not led by trans people. Mermaids can get in the sea.
All right, well, that's happening. I'd love for folks to ask any questions they have here. I have one question from Sibylla, who asked the question using the question and answer format. Sibylla says, one of the things that interests me is this second founding of TERFism. It seems to me that a lot of TERFs in 2020 have only had contact with TERFism through contemporary social media, unaware of people like Janice Raymond, and Janice Raymond and Mary Daly are kind of like the founders of anti-trans feminism back in the late 1970s. What does this tell us about how TERFism today differs from TERFism in the recent past and how to better combat it, considering funding from the radical anti-feminist organizations? I think this is a pretty interesting question, and I have sort of answered it in my article that you'll find at politicalresearch.org on the past political actions of the past 3 years by the Women's Liberation Front. And there are so many brilliant people on the call who I know could also answer it, like Mallory and like Bryn and like Jillian. I would I would say that white feminism, as in feminism that looks to only solve sexism instead of looking at the multitude of oppressions that impact us all, has always existed. I mean, you know, Janice Raymond and Mary Daly kind of lifted it in an interesting way from their, like, you know, kind of Catholic, right, theological backgrounds, and used kind of philosophy and theology to create this new sort of gender essentialism during the rise of queer liberation, right? And I would say that kind of never went away. Certainly a lot of younger people are finding groups that they resonate with through the internet, but that's true for every sort of wave of progress right now. You know, and the reason I think that anti-trans feminism had never gone away is you think about, you know, the Michigan Swimming Fest, for example, and, you know, lesbian separatism and the land movements of the 80s and 90s. Where, you know, some of those spaces were fundamentally exclusionary of trans people. I don't think you need to go back from, you know, all the way back to Janice Raymond to tie the thread to contemporary anti-trans feminists. I think you can go back just 10 years, 20 years, that there is a strong through thread all the way. But certainly echo chambers online are radicalizing a lot of people nowadays. We're seeing a lot of white supremacists get radicalized online. We're seeing a lot of incels get radicalized online. When you have nobody interrogating you or telling you that your viewpoint is narrow and based on a scarcity mindset, then you're going to think maybe that's the correct viewpoint. Mallory is saying that should point out that white trans feminists have routinely repeated the mistakes of white feminism, and white people like herself should be cautious of deploying white feminism as a descriptor without doing any reflection, as doing so will only further undermine existing radical trans, inclusive, and Black feminisms, which are doing a lot of innovation right now and need full support. I agree with that, and I have some quibbles, but we can talk about that offline on Twitter. Mallory, I'll see you on Twitter. Mallory says, cool. Bryn says, J.K. Rowling appears to have mostly self-radicalized online. She only listened to certain specific anti-trans narratives and ignored mainstream sources like WPATH, AMA, and the AAP. All right, we have a couple more questions here coming in the Q&A. Kyoki, do you want to be in charge of moderating those?
Sure. I'll start with the question that put forward by Ben New York's advocacy team, going back to the sports rhetoric. I have the hardest time bringing those conversations around for people who are pointing to science or science in quotation marks. People arguing science in quotation marks tend to not respond to any argument back besides science, which they feel less versed in. What approach do you think is the most effective response, best way to flip the script?
I mean, I guess I would ask other folks on the call if they've had any success in this rhetoric. But I also feel like there is a little bit of disingenuous engagement when someone will not listen to an argument rooted in empathy or in lived experience. Right? If someone is insistent that any discussion with them about trans justice be rooted in something specific and they refuse to hear lived experience, then I'm not sure that person is in a space right now for them to actually care about trans justice and inclusion.
I would also point out that mental health is a scientific discipline.
Yes, it is.
Felix is interested in if you have any insight into why voices from the UK have been made so particularly prominent by the US right in TERF rhetoric, and TERF adjacent rhetoric. Yeah,
there has been some incredible scholarship out there. And again, Bryn Tannehill on the call, I really recommend that everybody follow her on Twitter. She's incredible. And then Mallory Moore as well. Maybe they can Here, how about if you are comfortable with folks following you on Twitter, if you want to put your @ in the chat, people can find you and follow you. I don't want to tell people to, I'm sorry, Bryn and Mallory. But there is, you know, some folks have pointed out that there is a culture of kind of interrogation and skepticism in the UK, coming sort of from colonialism and the kind of, I'm going to say these words wrong, but kind of less religiosity in the UK than there is in the US. And that, Bryn says that she has a book that you can find on Amazon and on Barnes and Noble that has the answers to some of these questions. So the environment in the UK has permitted kind of white skepticism and white scientism. I say scientism instead of science because scientism is kind of the use of like scientific rhetoric to make things sound amazing. You know, like for example, using biology to justify colonialism, for example, and slavery. Bryn just linked her book, that has allowed white people in the UK to continue to be skeptical about anything, and to, as long as they base it in, you know, in skepticism and in scientism, it sounds smart. And we don't have the that tradition here in the United States. Our right wing is based in many things, but is also fundamentally underpinned right now in white evangelism, which is not rooted in the same kind of skeptical tradition as the UK is.
Adam Brown raises the flip side of this question, which is, are there any nations worldwide which demonstrate valuable policy for trans and gender nonconforming people which the US could replicate?
I would love to hear from folks in the chat about the answer to that question. Like the best places to be trans. There are many that have great laws on the books that whose actual enforcement of those laws is pretty spotty at best. Helen says Spain and Malta have pretty progressive policies. I don't know enough about international trans affirmation to tell you which places have the best policies and the best implementation of those policies. Bryn says New Zealand is the best. The only trans lobbying organization there disbanded because there was so little legal work to do.
Amanda also points out that New Zealand also fully decriminalized sex work. Smiley face.
Yeah, there's incredible overlap between anti-trans feminist advocacy and anti-sex work feminist advocacy, both firmly rooted in gender essentialism and this idea that sex is inherently violent, also rooted in early American feminist thought and second wave feminist thought.
Missy says Canada has full protections on gender identity, but still a lot of work to do. Similarly, Ireland too, although they're, according to Helen, their healthcare sucks.
Laurie Cook Daniels had a question on the questions and answers board over here that says, my organization Forge is a national trans anti-violence org. Our analysis is that there is an anti-male basis for a lot of turfism, particularly when they associate trans women with violence. So we do a lot of challenging of people's feelings about men and violence. Laurie, I would love to hear a little bit more about that if you want to put it in the chat. That sounds incredible. Yeah, I think that I have also noticed that there is an equating of, I'll be quite frank here, penises and violence, right? And so some people who have not been able to do that interrogation, as you said, the challenging of people's feelings about men and violence may still equate penises with violence instead of patriarchy and violence. And in fact, anyone can uphold the patriarchy, but it isn't actually the penis that's the problem. And I wanted to make a t-shirt that said, the penis isn't the problem, it's the patriarchy, but Teespring flagged it as problematic, so I couldn't make it. But if I ever find someone who lets me make that t-shirt, I'm gonna make a t-shirt that says that, so join me and it'll support trans orgs. Annie says screen printed, Heron. Yeah, if I had a screen printing machine. All right, I'm not going to read what Bryn says, but everyone should read it. All right, folks, I think what we should probably do is say goodbye and give people maybe 5 minutes to continue chatting with one another, but you certainly don't need to listen to me, although maybe Koki and I can kind of mutter over the top of it. But this has been really, really incredible. Make sure you connect with people who you connected with on the chat. Remember, you can privately message them if you choose the little drop down triangle, and you can choose someone who you've particularly connected with and ask them for their contact information. This is an incredible chance to connect with one another. Oh, Olivia says maybe that isn't true, that you can't chat individual people. So let me know if you can't. So I will be on Twitter in about 5 minutes summing this up, and you can meet me there and maybe we can continue the conversation. Some folks who are participating here will participate there as well, and you can meet them there.
I will also get everyone back to Heron's piece that we just published on politicalresearch.org. It is a fabulous retrospective of the last few years of anti-trans feminism, especially the intersection with the Christian right agenda.
Yay. Thank you so much, Koki. Thank you to Olivia for running tech behind the scenes. Thank you to PRA for supporting this incredible work. Thank you to all of you for being here, talking about anti-trans feminists.
Thank you, Heron, for making a heavy topic engaging and energizing and critical.
Hey, thanks. I know I look really good in this blazer, but I probably shouldn't have worn it because I'm super sweaty.
And for those of you who enjoyed today's webinar, we have 3 more in the PRA Summer Webinar Series. Check it out on our website, politicalresearch.org/summer series 2020. And you, because you subscribed to this webinar, you will receive information about upcoming webinars on white supremacy, COVID-19, and one other.
Yeah, do you want to drop that link in there? See if I can find it too.
That third webinar is about authoritarianism, and the link is in the chat.
Yay!